The committee will come to order. Good afternoon and welcome. We appreciate everybody joining us today. It's a little bit awkward with the votes going on, but we'll work around it to make as much progress as we can. Notwithstanding, we've got a great turnout, and I would like to begin by acknowledging the strong bipartisan teamwork that made today possible. I appreciate what our Republican colleagues did with their staff, working with our staff, brought together a great panel of witnesses in moving this hearing forward. We're holding the hearing virtually in compliance with the regulations for remote committee proceedings pursuant to House Resolution 965. This authority has allowed us to continue to do our work on behalf of the American people while keeping our staff, families, and the broader community safe. While we all have started to become familiar with navigating this technology more or less, I want to remind members of a few procedures. First, consistent with the regulations, the committee will keep microphones muted to limit background noise. Members are responsible for unmuting themselves when they seek recognition or when recognized for their 5 minutes. Second, members and witnesses must have their cameras on at all times. If you need to step away from the proceedings, please leave your camera on rather than logging off. Third, as we have votes during today's hearings, I don't intend to recess for the votes. Members should go vote when their group is up and come back as soon as possible. If your turn for questioning comes up while you stepped away, I'll come right back to you. First, without objection, Representative Afl-Cio will be authorized to serve as chair in the event of technical difficulties with my connection. He's been a real champion in this area, and I appreciate his special efforts. Today, the Trade Subcommittee is holding a hearing on enforcing the ban on imports produced by forced labor in Xinjiang. Forced labor is a term we use today for what is often described as modern slavery. It refers to work that is performed involuntarily and under the menace of any penalty. It refers to situations in which persons are coerced to work through the use of violence or intimidation, or by more subtle means, such as manipulated debt. In today's China, researchers and investigations have documented that the Chinese government is using forced labor in the production of all kinds of goods through a concerted program of oppression and concerted assimilation, coerced assimilation of China's Uyghur population and other Muslim minority groups. Our committee has a long history of grappling with the depravity of forced labor and ensuring that goods produced under such circumstances do not eventually make their way into grocery stores, shopping malls across our country. Congress passed a law prohibiting the importation of such goods nearly a century ago. The United States import ban is founded on principles of morality, of human and worker rights, as well as principles of fair economic competition. However, the history of the implementation of American ban on forced labor imports has been spotty, to say the least. The law had serious flaws, including the so-called consumptive demand loophole that eroded the principal underpinning of the prohibition by exempting goods made by forced labor if the United States could not produce those goods in sufficient quantities to meet consumer demand. That demand loophole was also a moral loophole. I was proud to work with my colleagues on this committee to close that loophole in a strong and bipartisan fashion 5 years ago. The strong forced labor import ban in the United States has become an important standard for worker protection and fair economic competition. Prohibiting the importation of goods produced by forced labor is now reflected in our updated NAFTA, where because of House Democrats' renegotiation of the pact, the obligation for the NAFTA countries is now a strong and unqualified prohibition. The import ban also serves as a clear and powerful economic sanction for countries whose government tolerate, cultivate, or at worst, perpetuate the coercion of labor. As both a sanction and as a tool to counter anti-competitive terms of trade, the United States forced labor import ban has an important role to play in addressing the Chinese government abuse of its Uyghur populations, human rights, and rights as workers. And that is the focus of our hearing today. So once we closed that loophole in 2015, our focus in improving the effectiveness of the American forced labor import ban has shifted to ensuring that the provision is meaningfully implemented and enforced. And it's certainly no easy task, and we'll discuss that today. The Department of Labor's annual report documents the presence of forced labor conditions in more than 70 countries and a wide and diverse set of goods. The ILO estimates 20 million people around the world are subjected to forced labor in the private economy, which generates $150 billion annually. Despite the pervasiveness of the problem, the enforcement mechanism has been dormant. When Congress closed the consumptive demand loophole, CPB has not taken an enforcement action in more than 15 years. In the nearly 5 years since closing the loophole, CPB has slowly increased its enforcement. Some positive steps have been taken, such as the ban on cotton from Turkmenistan in response to state-sponsored program of forced labor. However, much more needs to be done. Congress established the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force in the revised NAFTA Implementation Act to provide a central hub for the federal government to undertake this work and improve enforcement, not just for addressing the incidence of forced labor production in Canada and Mexico, but worldwide, and for counteracting the coercion of labor for Uyghurs in China. A key first step in establishing a clear process and timelines for responding to allegations of forced labor. The law requires that the Forced Labor Task Force produce a report that does just that. Unfortunately, Congress is still waiting on that report from the task force, which should have been submitted in August. Today, I call upon the Department of Homeland Security, which serves as interagency lead for the task force, to submit this task force report immediately, without further delay. I also want to emphasize the importance for this administration and any administration to comply with statutory mandates and timelines. The second step is establishing a proactive and comprehensive enforcement strategy for the federal government. This includes coordinating the efforts of the different agencies focused on forced labor. CBD needs to devote more resources to developing such a strategy and having the necessary enforcement personnel to investigate and enforce that strategy. These efforts will underpin an effective policy response to the subject of our hearing today, the treatment of the Uyghur and other minority Muslim populations in China, specifically the use of the forced labor in the Xinjiang province. It's clearly documented that Chinese government is subjecting over 1 million people to forced labor, trafficking, and enhanced surveillance. Under the auspices of saying they are combating religious extremism and poverty elimination, the Chinese government has implemented a program to convert Muslim minorities, mostly Uyghurs, to Chinese Han majority. The program includes the building of internment camps in Xinjiang, where Muslim minorities are sent to be re-educated. The scheme further includes forced labor for rural minority populations, current and former detainees of intern camps, and for prisoners. Survivors have reported many incidents of intimidation, threats of detention, or threats to family members, restricted movement, isolation, abusive working conditions, bans on religious practices, and excessive work hours. Today's witness, Rushan Abbas, will share with us details about the horrific conditions in Shenzhen as she recounts her time interviewing survivors across the globe. Despite the ongoing atrocities, the Trump administration has failed to take effective action to address these practices. During the negotiation of the Phase 1 China trade deal, the administration failed to even raise a single labor concern or raise concern regarding the abusive treatment of Uyghurs in China. This was a huge missed opportunity as an economic matter and a profound failure of leadership overall. It's even been reported by the Trump administration's former national security advisor that the president expressed approval for the Chinese President Xi's plan to build more detention camps for the Uyghurs in Xinjiang. Just this week, the CPB issued 5 withhold release orders, or WROs, which are intended to prohibit the importation of certain goods produced by companies and factories that use forced labor in Xinjiang. While issuing WROs are a positive step, they do not come close to adequately addressing the systematic problem in Xinjiang. Business and brands that import products made with forced labor into the United States must also play an important role in removing these abusive practices from the global supply chain. Just because supply chains are complex and this issue is difficult does not mean that we can shy away from making necessary changes. In response to the administration's ineffective approach thus far, the purpose of our hearing today is to examine the deeply troubling situations in Xinjiang and to craft a strong and effective American policy response using the forced labor import ban. I look forward to hearing from our distinguished witnesses on that front. And with that, I will recognize the ranking member, Mr. Buchanan, for the purpose of an opening statement.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
I can indeed.
Thank you for holding this important bipartisan hearing on enforcing the ban on imports produced by forced labor in Xinjiang. And thank you to the witnesses here today for taking the time to testify and share your views. It's clear and irrefutable that China is committing large-scale human rights abuses, including forced labor against the Uyghur and other ethnic minorities. The Chinese Communist Party continues to deny this reality, but we know it's not the case. The U.S. must lead in condemning and confronting these horrific practices. Our most powerful tool is strictly enforcing our ban on products made with forced labor so that these products do not enter the U.S. market, and this is a bipartisan issue. This bipartisanship was on display in 2015 and 16 when Congress strengthened the forced labor import ban by removing a long-standing exception to the ban through the Trade Facilitation and Trade Enforcement Act, led by then Chairman Paul Ryan and Kevin Brady. It was further confirmed this year when Congress overwhelmingly voted to approve the USMCA, which created the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. The Trump administration has already demonstrated a commitment to rigorous enforcing these prohibitions by issuing 15 withhold release orders since 2017 to halt imports of products made with forced labor. There's also intense support among U.S. stakeholders for this ban. A strong partnership with private sector and civil society is essential to exchange in our ability to enforce this ban. Businesses, in cooperation with the government and civil society, must establish and strengthen the best practices to tighten the supply chain so that they confidently prevent these suppliers from utilizing forced labor or find new suppliers. At the same time, the law must enforce transparency, predictability, and fairly so that all stakeholders know what steps they must take to be in compliance. That means that all parties must share information and allegations of forced labor abuses so that they can be investigated and verified. I look forward to the hearing from our witnesses today about the challenges they are facing and how we can help them achieve their goal. Lastly, our trading partners must step up and follow our lead in condemning China and cracking down on import products made with forced labor. It's no secret China is willing to use all tools at its disposal to intimidate and punish countries that oppose its illegal and immoral human rights abuses. I understand the immense amount of economic power China can exert, but our allies must stand firm with us in condemning these appalling abuses. Mr. Chairman, I'm glad this is not a partisan issue. I know that we both strongly support a thorough, effective, and strictly enforced ban on imports of products made with forced labor to force China to end its terrible abuse of human rights. Thanks again, Mr. Chairman, for calling this important hearing. I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Buchanan. I appreciate the partnership. I look forward to working with you to be able to move forward with legislation that addresses this, and look forward to proceeding with the hearing. Without objection, all members' opening statements will be made a part of the record, and we will now turn to our witnesses. And we have a distinguished panel of witnesses here to help us deal with the issue of forced labor in Xinjiang. I would first like to welcome Rushan Abbas, founder and executive director of the Campaign for Uyghurs. Then we will next hear from Scott Nova, executive director of the Workers' Rights Consortium. Following Mr. Nova, Amy Lair, the director and senior fellow of the Human Rights Initiative at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Then we will hear from Kathy Feingold, Director of International Development, International Department at the Afl-Cio. Following Ms. Feingold is Steve Lamar, President and CEO of the American Apparel and Footwear Association. Each of your statements will be made part of the record in its entirety, but I would ask that you summarize your testimony in 5 minutes or less so we can have ample time for our discussion. Ms. Abbas, would you please begin?
Yes, thank you so much, Chairman, and the distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify today for those Uyghurs who have been completely brutalized by the Chinese regime, now leading to genocide. While millions of Uyghurs have disappeared into China's concentration camps, millions more are being used as slaves in the largest government-directed human trafficking forced labor network of the modern-day history. The Chinese regime's chauvinistic nationalism, racism, hunger for economic advancement, its cutting-edge technology, and the CCP's goal of world domination through the Belt and Road Initiative, these are the reasons that Uyghurs are facing extermination in their own homeland. This issue is extremely personal to me because my own sister, Gulshan Abbas, a retired medical doctor, is one of the victims. She was abducted in September 2018. This happened only 6 days after I spoke out publicly about China's human rights abuses against the Uyghurs and the conditions of the camps, while outlining the disappearance of my husband's entire family. For the past 24 months since her disappearance, we have no information on her. And my story is one of the millions. The Chinese authorities have changed their narrative regarding these camps multiple times without much pause from the international community over their outright lies. Detainees includes doctors, elites, business people, and professionals, youth, and the elderly, none of whom need job training. First-hand accounts of the former inmates, those camps include mental and physical torture, rape, and the horrors that remind of us the atrocities in the history. With increasing reports of deaths and of otherwise healthy individuals, it's clear what's happening there. The Chinese authorities have declared the Uyghurs as people that need to be cured because of their religious beliefs, and the government is deliberately, literally eradicating them. So hear those words: forced marriages, mass rape, forced sterilization, arrest, torture, child abduction, organ harvesting, crematoria, and genocide. And we cannot merely acknowledge that genocide. We must recognize that the purchase of the clothes on our backs is funding those crimes. I had no idea that seeking to find my sister would involve finding out so many American companies are shockingly complicit in such disappearances. And it hurts me to think that my fellow Americans could be using products from my sister's forced labor. Recently, 13 tons of hair taken from the Uyghur detainees was seized, a product of genocide, 13 tons of hair. Can you imagine? This image, not just, how come this image doesn't pierce our conscience? Is this the hair of my sister? We know that this hair represents, we know what that represents. It's a physical representation of we are failing the vow never again. What else is needed for our leaders to take tangible actions against those brutality? How can anyone with a soul refrain from taking action? This is not just the calamity of the Uyghurs, this is a test for humanity. It saddens me to see that CCP is getting rewarded for genocide while my sister and the millions of other Uyghurs are being human collateral of the international trade deals and economic benefits. It horrifies me to see China continue to be allowed to become a power able to strong arm the world. What do you think is going to happen if this remains unchecked? Continuing to do business as normal with China today is unimaginable, and the true American values should not be sold for complicity in genocide. We cannot continue to fund the spread of China's totalitarian ultranationalism to the world. History will remember those who act and who fail to do so. The international community has already largely failed the Uyghurs. And I hope that we must ensure that's not too late. You can see more details in my written testimony and my recommendations on how we can address these atrocities. Failing to do so will result in their rapid replication and the darkness for all mankind. And I'm looking forward to the question and answer system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Boss, for your compelling, powerful testimony. Next, we'll turn to Mr. Nova, if you would begin.
Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, thank you for the opportunity to testify. After 2 years of research on forced labor in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and connections to global apparel brands, our organization has reached a conclusion shared by human rights, labor rights, and Uyghur groups around the world. The only way brands and retailers can ensure they are not using forced labor to make their apparel and are not thereby breaking the law when they bring that apparel to the US is to end all sourcing from the Uyghur region, from cotton to finished goods. The combination of widespread risk of forced labor across the region and insurmountable obstacles to the labor rights inspections apparel brands need in order to verify that workers' labor is voluntary means that as long as brands source from the region, they will be using forced labor. The scope of the problem is vast. The Uyghur region produces 1/5 of the global apparel industry's cotton and a sizable portion of its yarn. From Target to Walmart to Kohl's, from Gap to Uniqlo, from Amazon to Zara, the supply chain of virtually every brand and retailer that sells cotton garments runs through the Uyghur region. More than 2 billion articles of clothing with content from the region clear US ports each year on their way to the closets of consumers. The role of forced labor as a pillar of the Chinese government's repression in the Uyghur region is well documented. And it's well understood that the breadth of the problem means there is a risk of forced labor at any farm or factory. Less recognized is the fact that apparel brands have no ability to keep the farms and factories they use free of forced labor. The method they would normally employ to address severe labor rights risk is workplace inspections, called audits in the industry, performed by employees of a brand or by contracted auditing firms. Central to the methodology of every credible audit are interviews with workers held under circumstances that enable them to speak candidly without fear of reprisal. There is no Uyghur worker whose labor is coerced who can possibly feel safe conveying the truth to an auditor. The Uyghur population understands that statements against the interests of the government will draw brutal reprisal. Uyghurs also understand the ubiquity of the surveillance apparatus the government has erected to make sure such statements do not escape their notice. Under these conditions, the only purpose audits can serve is to create the false appearance of due diligence. This is exactly the role they've played. In early 2019, our organization documented forced labor at the Hetian Taida Apparel Company in Hotan. Customs and Border Protection issued a withhold release order against the company later that year. What we encountered in our investigation, along with proof of forced labor, were reports from multiple auditing firms giving the company a clean bill of health. This week, CBP announced a withhold release order against a glove factory in Yili Prefecture. When we tied the French brand Lacoste to that factory in March, Lacoste defended producing there, even after forced labor was exposed, by citing a clean audit from a prominent auditing firm called Bureau Veritas. When the Wall Street Journal uncovered the use of forced labor by Wafu Fashion, a leading yarn producer, Wafu also hired Bureau Veritas for an audit. The result, a clean bill of health for Wafu, later used by industry leaders to justify continued partnership with that company. The impossibility of due diligence is why more than 200 organizations from 36 countries have launched a call to action asking apparel brands to end their complicity in forced labor and stop all sourcing from the Uyghur region. The call to action also asks brands to cut ties with major Chinese firms implicated in forced labor and to ensure none of their suppliers in China are participants in the scheme to transfer workers from the Uyghur region to factories in other parts of the country. The proposed Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act also recognizes that due diligence is impossible and that an effective ban on imports is essential. If a ban is enacted through legislation or a region-wide act by CBP, enforcement will be complicated by the fact that very little of the apparel that has Uyghur region content is shipped to the US from the region. It comes instead from sewing factories across China and around the world that use fabric fashioned from Uyghur region cotton and yarn. Unless seeking preferential tariff treatment, most brands disclose nothing about the origins of cotton and yarn. Effective enforcement by CBP will require robust independent methods to verify sources of cotton, yarn, and garments backed up by public reporting. Our organization recognizes that the debate over the Uyghur region unfolds in a broader political context. As labor rights advocates, we have no interest in promoting and no desire to see greater hostility between the US and China. Our interest is combating forced labor. Forced labor in the Uyghur region is an urgent priority for us because it is the worst human rights crisis in the global apparel supply chain. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Next, we have Ms. Lair.
Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thanks for holding a hearing on this important topic and offering me an opportunity to speak today. Over the past year, CSIS has conducted research on forced labor in Xinjiang and how it connects to global supply chains. May I submit our October 2019 report and our July 2020 brief to the record? Thank you. Today, I'll discuss patterns of forced labor in Xinjiang, industries that may be linked to it, and provide recommendations. Forced labor in Xinjiang is unique. Typically, forced labor involves migrant workers who end up indebted to recruiters and have their passports confiscated, leaving them trapped in a foreign country. In contrast, in Xinjiang, the Chinese state itself is organizing the forced labor. It's part of a broader effort to cut minorities off from their culture and religion and increase loyalty to the CCP through detention, re-education, and work. Those subjected to forced labor include ex-detainees and the rural poor, who are transferred to work as part of what the government calls its poverty alleviation efforts. Our interviews indicate that in some cases, both ex-detainees and the rural poor are being threatened with detention if they don't accept work assignments. Both groups are being paid far below the minimum wage in some instances. The government transfers minorities to work at companies both within Xinjiang and in other parts of China. We learned to our surprise that the US is Xinjiang's fastest growing export market, increasing by 250% over the past year. Top direct imports into the US in order of prevalence are chemicals, hair, minerals, food products, apparel, plastics, and metals. However, as Scott noted, the vast majority of Xinjiang's products are used as inputs within China and don't ship directly to the US. It's therefore helpful to look at the Chinese government's priorities for growth in Xinjiang, which are agriculture, apparel and textiles, electronics, mining, including rare earths, chemicals, and medical equipment. Chinese companies in these sectors are more likely to be asked to build factories in the region and accept labor transfers from the government, and thus may present heightened forced labor risks. Xinjiang plays a really important role in the early stages of certain supply chains. It's certainly a key source of inputs for textile and apparel, possibly for solar energy and other sectors. The fact that Xinjiang's role lies so deep in some supply chains creates challenges on two fronts. First, companies and enforcement agencies must develop a much greater understanding at the chain of custody of products to know when Xinjiang inputs are being used. Most companies can only trace to tier 1 or 2 in their supply chain, which is often not where the problem lies. However, new technologies enable companies or enforcement agencies to test certain end products to identify their origins. Second, Xinjiang's inputs contaminate large portions of certain supply chains. To address this, not only is better traceability critical, but alternative supply chains must be rapidly developed. To do this rapidly, it will require not only long-term company sourcing commitments, but appropriate tariff incentives, development assistance for infrastructure, and potential loans for the Development Finance Corporation. Despite these challenges, the pervasiveness of forced labor in Xinjiang creates an imperative for action. My recommendations. Stability in Xinjiang via repression is a top priority for the Chinese government. Changing China's policies will be a significant challenge. US policy must be multifaceted to have a chance of diminishing abuses on the ground. Improved enforcement of the Tariff Act is a piece of the puzzle, but this will not be sufficient. The US needs to act in a consistent and principled manner and use its full array of tools and convince its allies to do the same. The US must show a predictable commitment to multilateral fora, and abuses in Xinjiang must be a constant priority in the G7, the UN, and in bilateral relations. Abuses in Xinjiang, including forced labor, should be a pillar of all high-level negotiations with the Chinese government, echoing US engagement with the Soviet Union in the later years of the Cold War. The administration should apply global Magnitsky sanctions to companies and their officers directly involved in forced labor in Xinjiang, some of which have a US presence, and encourage other countries like Canada and the UK to impose the same sanctions. Given the scale of Xinjiang-linked products likely entering the US, CBP will need extra resourcing to enforce the existing ban on goods, and especially if a broader ban is in place, a targeting strategy. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Compelling testimony. Next, we hear from Kathy Feingold, Director of the International Department at the Afl-Cio. Welcome, and you may begin.
Thank you. On behalf of the 12.5 million workers of the Afl-Cio, thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, and members of the subcommittee for inviting me to testify at this hearing today and for your leadership on this issue. In my many years of working on global worker rights issues, this is the first time where I have found that unions, employers, many governments, and global leaders actually agree about the gravity and scale of state-sponsored abuse in the Uyghur region. Given that there is shared recognition of the problem, now is the time to act together to end it. This means that corporations must take responsibility for source decisions, and the government must implement a new and far more effective approach to regulating global supply chains and enforcing our trade policies. The profiting by global corporations from forced labor in the Uyghur region represents an extreme reflection of the failures of the neoliberal model of globalization. For years, corporations shifted production to China to take advantage of the low labor costs, the overall repression of human rights in the country. Sourcing decisions by brands and suppliers are complicit with labor abuses, and they create a downward pressure on wages for all workers in the global economy. The U.S. already has laws dedicated to addressing forced labor. The 1930 Tariff Act clearly prohibits forced labor, but the rules of its enforcement predate the vast global supply chains of today and approach systematic problems with piecemeal approaches. The Tariff Act must be updated to reflect the current structure of the global economy and the need for effective enforcement of law. The Afl-Cio and our allies recently submitted a 1307 petition to CBP for a regional withhold release order. In response to the petition, CBP officials originally announced that they had sufficient evidence and intended to block imports from the entire region. However, this week, CBP announced 5 new WROs, but they remain far short of what is necessary to change the situation. And in spite of CBP issuing 12 previous withhold release orders on goods from the region, imports to the U.S. from the region have only increased. We strongly believe a regional WRO is needed to effectively address the violations. And as a very first step, CBP needs to enforce all the WROs it has issued and commit to increased transparency of its enforcement actions, ensuring that publications include the reason for the enforcement order, the number of shipments detained, and the value of the goods. Ending corporate complicity in and profits from this systemic use of forced labor and traded goods will require broader concrete actions, reforming the rules of the Tariff Act, as well as immediately passing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. The US should also work with counterparts in the European Union and Canada to build support for similar trade actions. The EU, consistent with its obligations under the WTO, should also prohibit the entry of these forced labor goods. The EU's proposed legislation on corporate accountability could hold EU firms accountable from benefiting from forced labor in their supply chains. Globally, the US government must regain its leadership and credibility within multilateral institutions and play a leading role at the United Nations by calling for an independent international mechanism to investigate the situation in the region and call for a special session of the Human Rights Council. At the International Labor Organization, the US should work with governments, employers, and unions to raise the visibility of this issue, including to support a governing body resolution condemning the widespread violations. In addition to government actions, we invite the large textile and apparel brands and retailers to sign on to the call to action launched in July by over 200 civil society groups calling for the end to corporate participation in supporting forced labor. The call to action provides an important platform for developing responsible exit strategies from the region. It, however, cannot replace robust government action. Let me end by reiterating the need to take actions, and actions that go beyond guidances and declarations and shaming. The US should use the full range of its trade and economic policy tools to end forced labor and build a new trade model that effectively protects the fundamental rights of workers in this region and worldwide. I hope that together we can end this extreme form of oppression and forced labor in the Uyghur region and ensure that no corporation profits off of this inhumane and illegal practice. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony. I take your point about the broad agreement on the nature and scale of the abuses, that might be able to translate into action. Really, really very much appreciate that. Next, we have Mr. Lamar.
Great. Thank you, Chairman Blumenauer, Ranking Member Buchanan, and the members of the subcommittee for holding this hearing and the opportunity to testify today on this important topic. My name is Steve Lamar. I'm the President and CEO of the American Apparel and Footwear Association. Our members include retailers, wholesalers, importers, exporters, and manufacturers. We make products that touch every American, and our industry employs nearly 4 million US workers. Our members in our industry have zero tolerance for forced labor. We work tirelessly to make sure it doesn't taint our supply chains in whatever form it takes and wherever it manifests itself. For more than 20 years, our members have implemented some of the most rigorous due diligence activities the private sector can muster to ferret out these practices. Our efforts have uncovered forced, bonded, and prison labor in some contract facilities around the world, and when we find it, we act, resulting in millions of dollars in repayment of illegal recruitment fees, payment of unpaid overtime and severance pay, stronger protections for workers, and better and safer working conditions around the world. Specifically in China, our members have instituted rigorous protocols to make sure their partners continue to adhere to our industry's zero tolerance of forced labor. For example, they ensure that their subcontract manufacturing partners in other parts of the country do not employ Uyghurs or other ethnicities who have been recruited via labor agents or vocational schools connected to the Chinese government. And I mention in other parts of the country because in the region, as Scott Nova mentioned, it's extraordinarily difficult to perform those traditional due diligence activities. As has been widely reported, the situation in the region is grave. This is a widespread campaign to repress and exploit Uyghur and other ethnic groups using many tactics, including forced and prison labor. This is intolerable. Our country and the world must unite to stop it. We employed the work done by the NGOs, activists, labor unions, members of Congress, and others to bring light to this issue, and deservedly so. We partner with a broad coalition of industry associations to align and bolster our efforts to help put an end to these forced labor practices. Together, we've coalesced around 4 principles I'd like to share today. First, our industry remains committed to ending forced labor. We are on the front lines of this battle. making sure that our workers are responsibly, legally, and voluntarily employed. We are constantly pioneering new methods and technologies to thwart forced labor. We build capacity, and we leverage the compliance arm of the US government in other countries. We share crucial intelligence and data with CBP so their enforcement can become more effective. CBP calls us trusted traders for a reason. Second, the problem in the region is bigger than any one industry can handle. Our leverage is limited. The situation in this region is of a scale, scope, and complexity that is unprecedented in modern supply chains. Moreover, forced labor, as horrendous as it is, and as we've heard already today, is only one component of a much larger campaign of oppression. We can only end this terrible situation through sustained government-to-government pressure that is led by the US government and involves all our allies and all our stakeholders. Third, we must use the tools at our disposal properly. To be most effective, WROs and other sanctions tools need to be targeted, transparent, prospective, fact-based, and developed with the trusted industry partners that will ultimately enforce them. Our industry consistently strives to go beyond mere compliance. When the US government enforcement tools themselves are vague or poorly defined or retroactive, even basic compliance and enforcement becomes next to impossible. We've been hearing in the last few weeks about a rumored blanket WRO, one that would, for example, declare all cotton from the region as a product made with forced labor. There's been a lot of talk about legislation that would declare any product or input originating from the region to be made with forced labor. Such a WRO and such legislation would no doubt make headlines, but they would wreak havoc to human rights, economic development, and legitimate supply chains, themselves already battered by COVID-19 all over the world. In my written statement, I provide more details, but suffice to say that as a country, we simply do not have the capability or capacity to implement, comply with, or enforce a blanket WRO or the proposed legislation right now. Moreover, these actions would do little to stop the use of Uyghur forced labor, or more importantly, everyone's goal of ending the campaign of oppression of Uyghurs and other ethnic Muslim minorities. And that brings us to my final point, which is to stay focused on the ultimate goal, which is to end these forced labor practices in the larger campaign of oppression it fuels. Among other things, this means we need to stay engaged so we can create safe, responsible, and legal alternatives to what the campaign are currently offering the Uyghur populace. We need to keep the pressure focused on those actors in China that are perpetuating the system. We need to evaluate our joint efforts through the lens of what will most effectively get us to our end goal. And we need a partnership that combines NGOs, industry, unions, Congress, and the rest of the US government and other governments to take a comprehensive approach to resolving this horrific situation. I look forward to our discussion and continuing our partnership on this critical matter.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lamar. And I am encouraged by the positive expression of interest in solving the problem and look forward to working with you and your members in understanding what actually we can do and refining targeted solutions. Without objection, each member will be recognized for 5 minutes to question our witnesses. We will not observe the Gibbons rule in this remote setting, but instead will go in order of seniority, switching between majority and minority members. Members are reminded to unmute yourself when you are recognized for 5 minutes. I'll begin by recognizing myself. As our witnesses have highlighted, the problem in Xinjiang are pervasive and impact supply chains throughout Southeast Asia and beyond. I'm intrigued by how we could tackle such a daunting problem. I would note that the CPB has taken some experience on this front, thinking of the WRO it issued on cotton from Turkmenistan. I'd like to pose this question to Ms. Feingold and Mr. Nova. Has the Turkmenistan cotton WRO been enforced? Is this a success story? Are there things we can learn from our experience there? When we think about Xinjiang and the development of real plans to disincentivize supply chains from sourcing material from that region, how should we approach going about this task? Mr. Feingold?
Thank you, Chairman. So thank you for that question. And I want to recognize that what happened in Turkmenistan actually was a really important first step because it was a change in policy by CBP. It showed it was willing to move beyond facility and level enforcement and really issue a broader WRO, which is our request at this time for the Uyghur region. But, in answer to your question, has it been successful? I unfortunately have to say to you, I wouldn't know. I mean, I have to tell you no, because there really is no transparency about what CBP is doing. They never disclose if they've actually enforced the WRO by detaining shipments. I've only received information from my work in a coalition where we've heard that some shipments have been detained, but I actually got this information from an affected importer who wanted to talk to me about it directly. So we need greater congressional oversight on CBP. We need to get greater data on their actions around enforcement. If we're all in this together, then we need to have the same information to know what's actually happening and if this is going to be successful. I would say before I know, Scott jumps in, that a regional WRO is so important because it creates one legal framework, one set of rules for all companies. China's a tough place. One company doesn't want to stick its head up. They have good reason to be concerned about their workers, in the retail workers in that country. So there needs to be one framework, one set of rules, and we believe that's why you need this regional WRO, and it would require increased capacity at CBP and increased resources, financial.
Mr. Nova, do you have anything to add?
Yes, I'd agree that the region-wide nature of the ban was critical, a very important step and precedent, but that enforcement has ranged from thin to non-existent, even though well after the ban was announced, there were products coming into the U.S. being openly advertised as containing Turkmenistan cotton. So we will need, if there is a region-wide WRO or the passage of legislation that creates a region-wide ban, a much more aggressive, creative, and critically publicly transparent effort by CBP to enforce.
Thank you. Here in the United States, we're going through our own struggle with racial discrimination and addressing the legacy of enslavement in our country. This year, many businesses and major brands have taken important steps to condemn discrimination by making public statements and commitments to invest in promoting racial justice and human rights. I want to commend their leadership with their efforts and also ask Ms. Lair, how can the American government work with U.S. importers to address the use of forced labor in Xinjiang? And Mr. Lamar, what are American companies prepared to do to invest to make sure they're not profiting off the fruits of forced labor and human rights abuses?
So I'll just offer a few ideas. I mean, it's obviously a complex area. Under the existing laws, one thing we've proposed is that CBP use a series of red flags that we identified in our October report last year that would help them. It basically is a strong indicator of risk if these red flags come up, that there could be forced labor, and that would make it their evidentiary gathering much easier. So that would be one really low-hanging fruit as a starting point. I also think there are areas like requiring or incentivizing much stronger traceability efforts by the sector or by various sectors would actually be really important both for this problem and beyond. And you can also think about due diligence requirements, and that could also assist CBP as they think about who to target. Thank you.
Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you. Mr. Lamar?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So there's a number of steps we're taking. We are, companies are developing alternative capabilities and capacities around the world. There's a long-term diversification outside of China and outside of the region, and that's been going on for some time, and that's continuing. It's probably accelerating. Those in China are continuing to double down on efforts to make sure that Uyghurs that are in their employment are not in their employment as a result of recruitment from a vocational school or government entity. There's a lot of diligence that's done there, and we are finding voluntary and legal employment of Uyghurs there. So there is some good news in that category. We're working very hard to promote more tracing technologies. I think only eclipsed by the effort to find a COVID vaccine. We are working desperately, pioneering a number of looking to pioneer a number of technologies, whether it's DNA-based, bio-based. There's a lot of varieties of people are looking at it, but those technologies aren't there yet. And we hope they'll be there soon, but they're just simply not there yet. And last, we're coming to hearings like this, and we're advocating for our government to step up, again, to pull together a group of other governments and other stakeholders. This is going to require sustained, high-level government-to-government efforts to make sure that we can address the underlying problems.
Thank you. Do you just have an observation about what happened with the Turkmenistan cotton WRO? Do you have any understanding of how that's worked?
Well, I would probably hear a lot of agreement. I mean, I think that as a regional WRO, it provides a good learning opportunity, and we would certainly love to hear more from Customs on what their learnings have been. Have they been able to implement it? Has this given them the tools that they can use to implement other kinds of regional or other broader initiatives? Until we see that, we really need to focus on fact-based, evidence-based procedures. So we think there should be a lot more transparency, a lot more process, a lot more engagement with stakeholders. And we'd like to hear, I think, just like what Kathy said, a little bit more information about what the results have been.
Thank you. Ms. Boss, we deeply appreciate your sharing your family's story with the committee. Just heartbreaking. It could not have been easy for you to make this testimony today. We want to make sure that whatever policies America adopts do not further harm the Uyghur population. Do you think that the United States effectively banning the import of goods from that Uyghurs in China have been forced to produce in violation of their human and economic rights would make an important difference?
Well, thank you so much, Chairman. The beneficiaries of the Uyghur forced labor are not the Uyghurs, and it's very clear that the aim and the end goal of these forced labor policies is not to promote the policies not to promote the well-being of the Uyghur society. In fact, similar agreements were made about the justifying slavery in this great country, in the United States, back in when slave owners maintained that without them the slaves would be worse off or would starve. This is just a paternalistic argument that the Chinese government is saying, they are providing the Uyghurs opportunity to have jobs and they have a better lives. No, those are all lies. The Uyghurs, it's not because of the Uyghurs' lack of ability to do better life than this slavery in those factories. We cannot support those institutionalized evils. Freedom is the only way to live, and for Uyghurs to being able to feed themselves, which is not even guaranteed when they are working under those factories. We are hearing that they are starving, they are not getting enough food, and whatever they are supposed to get, those money is supposed to send back to whoever those temp companies or whoever is sending them. So it's not only a qualification for better life, but just the Chinese government's and other narratives. We should be concerned with how we can force the CCP to allow Uyghurs to live as human beings so that better options for life are available for them. The Uyghurs are fighting to survive right now. As we have discussed, and many of the Uyghurs who are held are actually being used as slaves are intellectuals, actors, musicians, and all the intellectuals. As my sister, a retired medical doctor, where does that argument stand in light of that information? The Uyghur community really supports the departure of the corporations from the Uyghur region and from China, because we need to unplug the lifeline from this monstrous regime and the acting like a total threat to any kind of freedom and democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Mr. Buchanan, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and taking your time. Mr. Lamar and Mrs. Feingold, let me ask you, I think in terms of this whole thing is horrifying with the forced labor. What more can the U.S. do to lead? I think we've made some progress, but obviously not enough. And how do we bring our partners in and stakeholders in and industry in where we can even have a much bigger impact? Because obviously this is something that we talk about, and we do something, but not enough. And we got to figure out how to raise the bar, so to speak, in terms of this area of forced labor. Mr. Lamar.
Thank you for the question. Well, the forced labor working group process, I think, is the first place to start. We need to make sure that all of our tools, all the enforcement tools that we have, are effective, efficient, and deployed in a manner that's going to help us get to the end goal. I think there needs to be a lot more coordination, a lot more process that's addressed, so we can make sure those tools work. And I'm glad to see that there's been some work, but we're going to need to see more, obviously, in the coming months. And this really needs to be expedited. And then on the larger stage, and I've heard a couple of recommendations to this effect too, I think also from Kathy, is that we need to convene at the highest level and consistently all those countries that should be aligned with us, and those that aren't, get them aligned with us. This is a global issue. The cotton that comes out of that region, 20% of the cotton from China, that threads through most countries. Every country has an interest in stopping these practices. So we need to align them, pull them together, and speak with one voice.
Ms. Feingold?
Thank you for the question. I would, reiterate that we have a tremendous opportunity right now. Yesterday there was a Pew poll that came out that showed really the U.S. global leadership is seen as being greatly diminished by our allies. But I think this issue can help us rebuild credibility in our standing in multilateral institutions. We need to make this a key issue in all of our diplomatic efforts. And so I really think that the world is watching. The world is waiting to see how the U.S. is going to lead on this issue of forced labor. We had some missed opportunities that have been mentioned. The Phase 1 trade agreement did not include any mention of worker rights. The feeling that our administration has sent signals that we don't really care that much about this or what happened in Hong Kong. I think we need to reboot. We need to make sure the world knows that we're serious. We've built new mechanisms in the USMCA. We need to say, we take this really seriously about forced labor. So I think there's a tremendous opportunity here. Again, I think people want to know and companies want to know there's a set of rules that are going to be effectively enforced in the U.S. And let's make sure our European allies are clear. This should be a huge transatlantic project. Let's get it done. Let's end this.
Mr. Lamar, let me ask you, I think one of the critical things is getting accurate and timely information that is verifiable between all the parties and industry and governments. How do we take that to another level? Because that's my sense, what I've heard is making sure when you go to accuse someone or what the actual facts are. How do we make sure information is something governments can share and work together on and trust each other about?
Well, for sure, governments have to share that. And I think we can start with our own government to make sure the evidentiary standards, the process that we use to receive allegations is clear, transparent, predictable, that the ability to respond to those allegations is also clear and transparent, because sometimes people make allegations and the allegations may be false. I mean, that's what our legal system is built on. We need to make sure that we have an opportunity to learn from our past enforcement actions. We need to make sure those enforcement actions are also implemented in a way that the industry can take advantage of them. When there is a WRO that is announced, my members and others in the industry, we make sure that our suppliers, and their suppliers aren't connected to those entities. So we use those WROs as really important tools and guideposts to know who are some identified bad actors. And so having that information out there more public and in a transparent, prospective way is where I would start. The COAC, the Customs Operations Advisory Committee, has come up with a number of very useful recommendations, and I would encourage the subcommittee to take a look at those recommendations and support many of them. I think that's a great place to start too.
Well, thank you. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Buchanan. We turn now to Mr. Pasquale.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I must say that the panel is very, very impressive. All of them, the panelists, and reasonable. So I think that if we mean what we say, and there's no reason to believe you don't, we can expect some changes, particularly from within, because we have not spent much time in the last 5 years when we talk about trade, about the responsibility of the corporation itself. We expect that the government is going to be able to overcome its own cultural uniqueness, depending on which country you're talking about. I think Mr. Lamar provided some very good recommendations. But there's no denying, and I think he would agree with me, that we have a pathetic scene here. I would characterize the administration's response to the credible and disgusting violations of human rights happening in Xinjiang region as pathetic. We closed the forced labor import ban loophole, elevated the issue by creating the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. That, I believe, was a tangible step in the right direction. But this administration had to be dragged to stand up the task force. And it's a month late in sending Congress its report. Because if this doesn't happen at the top in our own country, or if this is not a priority, and I've looked through all the narratives on trade, this administration doesn't talk about labor practices, really. Also, forced labor was never an issue raised during the negotiations in the original Trump-China agreement. You show it to me. Forced labor, never an issue. We have credible reports of modern slavery in China. The law makes importers responsible, the law itself, for removing these abusive practices from the supply chain. And I know the supply chain is complicated, as we're finding out in the United States through this terrible pandemic. The CBP, the Customs and Border Protection, knows what is happening, yet it doesn't take real action. That's got to change. But this is not just Trump's problem. Corporations, as importers of record, are responsible too. Whether it's a major movie studio filming in the backyard of forced labor camps, Kraft Heinz possibly buying tomatoes to make ketchup, or apparel companies like Nike potentially using cotton harvested by forced labor, we need accountability because it's wrong. It needs to be stopped. Forced labor is despicable. It destroys lives. It destroys families. Forced labor is also terrible for the American worker by making them compete against exploited labor. Think about that. My district has been impacted. A concern in August about forced labor caused Lenovo to proactively shut down a factory making Chromebooks. These laptops were needed by students in Paterson, New Jersey to start the school year. While Paterson was able to find another last-minute supplier, our students' education should never be in question. A better auditing process and more aggressive action by CBP could have prevented this from happening. I appreciate CBP needs more resources. That's why I've led with many other congressmen an appropriations letter in support of increasing the staff and resources to prevent forced labor. This is for naught, however, if this administration doesn't get off its duff and act and make this a priority. So, Scott, I'd like to ask you this. The CBP targeted 5 companies in the Xinjiang region. Given the wide-ranging allegations of forced labor, does targeting specific companies give the appearance that forced labor is not being used elsewhere? What do you think, Scott? Give me a short answer to that one, please.
I'm sure the risk that by targeting a very limited number of individual factories, that the impression might be given that the problem is not as widespread as it is. The reality is the risk of forced labor exists at any factory and any farm in the Uyghur region, and that is why regional action is essential.
Great.
I'm sorry.
Thank you, Bill. That you started your question when your time's expired. Could we move on? Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing. I think the more hearings we can have on China and human rights abuse is really great, and I really appreciate your time and attention to this. And it's clear, I think, to all of us that human rights abuses committed by the Chinese Communist Party against its own people, especially in forced labor and genocide of Uyghur Muslims, cannot and should not be tolerated. As today's testimonies make clear, the Chinese Communist Party leverages these atrocious practices in concert with tools of economic warfare to threaten our economic and national security. I'm particularly concerned with China's continued theft of intellectual property of American businesses and infiltration of our universities. And in fact, I've introduced legislation to this manner. And also we have a task force on the Republican side that we've been working with, and we've come out with some additional policy proposals that we'd love to share with you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Lamar, I'm just going to ask one question here. I know you've provided some insight in your testimony, but I'd like to give you a little more opportunity on the different practices that are used against the U.S. apparel industry and any thoughts you have on holding China accountable. And with that, I'll mute my line to so we can get the response. And thank you again, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Congressman. Yeah, so in our industry, there's an extensive array of tools, which I mentioned and written and mentioned also in the oral statement as well. Codes of conduct, terms of engagement. We have extensive education, extensive training that gets done, and then audits, verifications to make sure that the principles that we put in place are actually happening. And this is a iterative process. It's a continually evolving process. Like you mentioned, intellectual property rights, we do a lot of work to fight against counterfeiters. Counterfeiters are constantly trying to outwit us, and so we have to constantly try to outwit them. And those that are intent on exploiting workers are constantly trying to change their tools, and so we have to do that as well. And that's where we find ourselves with this situation. This is a region where the problems associated with the forced labor have grown up in the last 5-10 years. There's obviously been bigger problems there before, but it's become recent, and as a result, that's why we're stepping up and we're raising our voice to encourage. Again, a whole of government approach, but then a whole of government approach linked to other governments too, so we can actually address these problems once and for all.
Well, I really appreciate that, Mr. Lamar. And obviously, coming from California, we actually grow a lot of high quality cotton that I know there's been more and more activity in terms of knowing the source of the product and how it travels away ultimately to get processed, and then whether or not there's forced labor used in that. And I know some of the technology that the cotton industry has developed in concert with the U.S. apparel industry, you can actually track some of that back to ensure that you know the source of that material. So I want to encourage that continued practice and thank all of Americans. If we can know where our products are coming from, the better. And especially, we don't want to be buying it from people that are suffering, like the Muslims in China. So with that, Mr. Chair, thanks again, and I will yield back.
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. Next, we have Congressman Kind. Ron, do we have you? Let's go to Congressman Davis. Congressman Davis.
Earlier this week with respect to China's forced labor imports ban that Democrats worked to fix in 2015. Certainly, it is better than no action being taken at all. But I'd like to hear from the witnesses whether you think that action is meaningful. There are now perhaps as many as 36 forced labor facilities in Xinjiang producing goods with Uyghur prisoners, but the WRO only covers 5 facilities. And how could the new order be enforced? It seemed to me that it would be extremely simple to relabel goods from one of the plants as goods of a plant not on the list. Is there really any way to effectively enforce, besides a presumption that all goods from Xinjiang are made with forced labor and forbidden with only goods that meet the burden of proving that they are not forced labor goods? And if the witnesses could respond to that and answer, I would appreciate it.
Congressman, I'm not sure if you are directing that at anyone specifically, but I'll take a stab at that. Actually, we think enforcement is best done when you have targeted, entity-specific, and again, fact-based investigations that lead you to the conclusion that there is products that are, mined, produced, or manufactured with forced labor. That's literally what the statute calls for. So there shouldn't necessarily be a limit to the amount of WROs we can do, just provided those WROs are each substantiated by the facts. As you go to a regional WRO, where if you, for example, change the burden of proof, that becomes much more difficult to enforce because now you're talking about something that is threading throughout the entire globe. And you will run into a situation actually where not only are you straining customs authorities and abilities to enforce that, and maybe we saw that with Turkmenistan, I don't know, but you will find that companies in my industry will do what they can do to enforce it. They'll put in compliance procedures, they'll accelerate or try to manage it the best that they can, but without the proper tracing technology, without the proper capabilities and capacities around the world, they won't be in a position to be as effective on that. And then there will be those who will be intent on breaking the law they'll violate them freely. So now you'll have a gap between those who want to comply and those who don't want to comply. And that's the problem. That's the concern that we're really worried with a much larger regional approach.
If I may, the problem with a targeted approach is that it only works when there are a limited number of targets. When you have a region-wide problem, as is the case now in the Uyghur region, when there is forced labor risk across the region, and when Steve acknowledges there is no way to perform labor rights due diligence, then unless you ensure that all imports to the region are prevented, you are guaranteeing that you're continuing to import goods made with forced labor.
Ms. Feingold, could I know that the Afl-Cio has been actively engaged in the processes of trying to get at this issue. Is there a way to determine how effective the WROs are being? I mean, how do you determine whether or not there have been the changes that we're seeking and the changes we're promoting?
Thank you so much for your question. I would say that in order for us to really know, we need a lot more transparency coming out of the CBP. We need them to maintain and regularly update a public webpage that has basic information about enforcement, the list of active petitions, investigation, goods targeted. Right now, those of us that are working to address this issue really don't get the needed information from CBP in order to make a judgment whether or not they are effectively doing their job. What we can confirm is the egregious violations are continuing. So we know that whatever is happening is not happening in a way that addresses this. And I wanted to just also jump in on what Steve said is the problem with the piecemeal approach. We have seen this time and time again. We are trying to dismantle an economic model that's based on forced labor. So you can't just pull piecemeal different pieces. We need to all agree that the system was built on, I mean, we know that the global economy was built around labor arbitrage. This particular system was built to use forced labor. And so we need to agree that it can't be one by one that's going to not have a huge impact on China, not change the system. We need to have an approach that deals with the problem, which is an economic model that's based on forced labor and severe repression.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Davis. Congressman Kind.
Thank you, for holding this very important hearing. And I want to thank all the witnesses for your excellent testimony today. But I sit back and think it's kind of the dog that hasn't barked in the hearing that needs more attention. I mean, if President Trump's former national security advisor, John Bolton, is to be believed, the President of the United States gave Xi Jinping the green light to establish Uyghur concentration camps and the exploitation that came from this. And the Phase 1 China agreement, there's no mention, not one word, not one sentence in the agreement that addresses this imperative issue. Now, the president may be reticent at best about this, but we in Congress should not be complicit. Ms. Feingold, let me ask you, there's discussion about possible additional legislation to crack down on this. I'm wondering how necessary that is. I, along with Chairman Blumenauer and others in 2015, when it came to reauthorization of the Trade Enforcement Act, worked hard to address the consumptive demand loophole and make sure that we had clear language enforceable with resources to PVP to prevent the importation of products based on the exploitation of slave and forced and child labor. Is there an argument to be made that we need to enhance the already law under the Trade Enforcement Act and making sure that CBP has the resources they have? Because like you, I am concerned about the lack of responsiveness from CBP. When I've reached out to them asking for more information, there's a lack of candidness, transparency, information that they're willing to share. And additionally, what additional leverage do you think Congress has to really make the Trade Enforcement Act work the way we intended it to when we passed it with President Obama in 2015?
Thank you so much, Representative, for your question. Absolutely. I think that legislation is really important because, again, it sets out the framework because especially it has bipartisan support. And I think that is also a really important message. I started my comments by saying, this is a rare moment. We have some common ground here, and we really should be building off of that common ground. I think legislation is also important because it sends a strong message to our allies that, this is what it should look like. This is the framework that perhaps they can use. We're taking this seriously. Absolutely, we need additional congressional oversight. You need to be asking these hard questions about CBP. Where are your actions? Where's the data? What are you doing? We can't get that information, so we think that increased congressional oversight is really important. So yes to this important legislation and to increased oversight.
Well, there is one point of leverage coming up soon before Congress again, and that's reauthorization of the Trade Promotion Act. And I'm willing to work with any of my colleagues on committee to address this glaring problem we have right now with CBP, the reporting requirements, the transparency, the responsiveness that we're working with them. So. But let me also just stay with you for a second. Is there a play that can be had here through the World Trade Organization in developing international consensus and the rules of trade to truly crack down on this exploitation of labor on a global basis?
I think we have said for years the WTO needs to be reformed. It needs to take seriously enforceable labor rights issues. We've said this for years. The initial Havana Charter actually recognized it. You need trade policies that are rooted in asking the question, do these policies contribute to the well-being of people? Yes or no? The WTO currently doesn't do that. I would welcome any efforts to strengthen labor rights protections, address forced labor, make them binding and enforceable at the WTO.
Mr. Nova, let me ask you, you raised in your testimony the issue of verification of supply chain problems when it comes to products based on forced labor. Is there an enhanced role for the private sector to be playing, companies that are actually importing these products to look downstream and do a better job themselves in prohibiting this type of practice before they import these products?
There absolutely is. There is a lack of transparency in global supply chains, and some brands and retailers don't know where their cotton and yarn comes from. But it's very important to stress, brands and retailers that don't know have chosen not to know. Brands and retailers have the ability to control where cotton and yarn is sourced in their supply chain, to determine who their business partners are in the supply chain from the top to the bottom, and they need to take the necessary actions to do that. They do it when it suits their interests. For example, when they're claiming preferential tariff treatment based on the origin of yarn or cotton. These are global corporations that have built supply chains that are enormously effective at yielding what the brands and retailers want, which is generally inexpensive goods produced quickly. If brands and retailers devoted the same energy and effort to tracing cotton and yarn, and more broadly to preventing forced labor that they do to those other priorities, we'd see fundamental change.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kind. We're now going to go to the 2-to-1 ratio, and we'll start with Mr. Holding.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much for holding this very timely and important hearing today. The ongoing repression of ethnic minorities in China cannot be stopped by our government alone. In order to put an end to forced labor in China altogether, we need to create a unified front through strong partnerships with our private sector and our foreign allies. Now, right now, the trade agreements that are in negotiations and those that are up for renewal would create a shift in raw material sourcing. We realize now more than ever the importance of stabilizing and reshoring our supply chains, so finalizing and renewing trade agreements with our strong international partners will help us shift away from China and will avoid the possibility of entry of products made with forced labor into our supply chains. We need to capitalize on the robust American private sector as a strategic partner. North Carolina is the proud home to the largest textile mill industry in the country, and they're dedicated to working with Customs and Border Protection to solve this problem. In order to see this through, we need to develop an efficient and transparent WRO process that will help identify and remove forced labor from our supply chains. It's my understanding that the CBP issued another 5 withhold release orders this week, and that a broader Xinjiang-wide WRO order is in the works. And I'm glad to see CBP use its authority to enforce our laws, and I urge them to continue open communication with stakeholders to optimize the use of withhold release orders. So my question, now direct it to Mr. Lamar, are there any specific developments that could be made to ensure that the WRO process is more effective? And how do you think we can expand our relationship with private partners and foreign allies to ensure China is held accountable and ends forced labor of Uyghurs and the other ethnic minorities in China? Mr. Lamar?
Thank you, Congressman. You've been an incredible leader for the textile and apparel industry for many years, and we really appreciate your leadership there. For your specific question on how to improve the WROs, I would simply say what I mentioned before is we look at what the COAC has produced. They've produced a number of reports, including 2 during the last 4 or 5 months, that make a number of recommendations about improving and making clear the evidentiary standards, providing for more transparency, which a number of the witnesses have mentioned already today. So we all have a better sense of what's going on, both as the WRs are being developed, but then also so we learn about them on a timely basis so we can actually use those WROs to enhance and enforce our own compliance and enforcement efforts around the world. I think we should look at whether and how we get customs more funding, because it's clear that this is a potent tool that needs to be used more. Again, I would say used properly, be entity specific, be fact-based, and to comment on a point that was made before, the WROs are not the be-all and end-all. This is a regional problem that requires larger solutions. The WROs are not going to address the regional problem. The WROs are going to address problems where the facts emerge and we can use them, and then we'll have other enforcement tools as well. But to address the regional nature of this crisis, that's when we need to bring out the bigger guns. And that's why I keep going back to the need to get government-to-government efforts and bringing our allies on board with us.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back because I need to run vote.
Thank you very much. Next, we have Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
Loud and clear.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for holding this very important hearing. It comes at an important time. And I want to thank all of our witnesses. The information that you brought to us is very important and offered in a really compelling fashion. So I appreciate all of the input that we received. I want to sort of bring this back home to my district if I can. And first of all, I mean, obviously, the kind of forced labor that we're talking about, is an egregious use of authority and a terrible example of how cheap labor in China often undermines not only human rights, but the American economy. So I want to emphasize that the moral imperative, the moral aspect of this question is the most significant piece of it. And it's the one that I think ought to be the strong underpinning of American policy. It ought to drive not only our law, but the way we use existing law in order to promote values that we think are important and transcend boundaries. Having said that, it's also important to note that there's an economic impact to the use of forced labor and the abuse of and specifically of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang. So I wonder, Ms. Feingold, if you might help me by translating in economic terms what this means to, say, the American worker, maybe a factory worker, an auto worker in my hometown. What effect does this abuse and this exploitation have on them? because I think it's important that we explain it in terms that folks can understand the impact.
Thank you very much for your question, Representative. I think obviously Michigan is a great example of the challenges of the economic model that we're up against and that we're discussing here today. When we don't have regulations in this country about how we are producing, how we're setting up supply chains, what happens is precisely what happened in Michigan in the auto sector. You had supply chains leave the country. Companies no longer were paying taxes there. It affected the revenue base. It affected the ability of working people to have a decent job, a decent community. And so we began to see a system of labor arbitrage whereby companies left Michigan, went around the world looking for, low labor costs, places with low unionization rates, and often repressive environments. China is an extreme case of this model. It is also, though, I want to be clear that what we're saying is not, leave this place for another repressive model. What we're saying is what we need are trade, economic, and investment policies that are based on fundamental worker rights. You level the playing field so that the auto worker in Michigan is able to produce, or that we can make PPE in this country and know that it's being made decently with fundamental worker rights protected. So this is really important, why I keep coming back to this is an economic model that needs to be undone, and we need to build new trade and economic models that start with the fundamental premise: we must protect the rights of all workers, whether in Michigan or in the Uyghur region.
Thank you very much for that. And I wonder if I might just turn to the panel. There's obviously a lot of discussion now regarding China. The president often refers to how tough he is on China. I know that the growers and the manufacturers that I represent back home, particularly in the context of the Phase 1 agreement, expected to be able to access some of these markets. And of course, that hasn't happened. And we also know that we have the authority under existing law. Customs and Border Patrol has the authority to enforce against products that are derived from forced labor. And I just would like to get comment in the brief time I have left regarding the extent to which existing authority is being used by this administration to stop products from coming in. I mean, we do need more law, and we need better law. And I agree with Ron Kind regarding Trade Promotion Act. But under existing law, is enough being done? Anyone?
So I'll get back to thank you for the question. Something I said earlier, which is that even under existing law, CBP could be making certain presumptions that we think would be factually grounded. There are high indicators of forced labor, and they could identify, we've done the work. We know you can do it. It's hard. You need Mandarin skills, but it's doable. And so they could, at a minimum, be making some presumptions that would enable them to broaden their targeting. So that would be, I think, an easy first step that could have been done some time ago.
Thank you. I see my time's expired. Again, thanks to all the witnesses, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Kildee. Mr. Panetta. Do we have?
You're muted.
Let's go to Ms. Murphy. We'll catch Mr. Panetta later in the proceedings. Is Ms. Murphy? Ms. Sewell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
You bet.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for holding this important hearing about the human rights abuses against the Uyghur people in the Xinjiang region of China and the troubling, very troubling use of forced labor in the global supply chain. Everyone should be deeply concerned about the reports laying out how millions of Uyghurs have been detained in so-called re-education camps, where they're forced to perform tough labor while being subject to terror, physical abuse, and indoctrination. The United States has a moral and economic and strategic imperative to respond to these abuses. We must use our unique position in the global trading system to advance our values of workers' rights and the freedom and dignity of all people. I was proud to work with my colleagues last year to strengthen labor standards for North American workers in the USMCA trade agreement. We must similarly use the diplomatic and economic power of the United States to eliminate forced labor practices by our trading partners and global businesses. I am highly disappointed, as my colleagues have indicated, that the Trump administration has not taken more meaningful action to address these issues. It is troublesome. It is actually really troublesome and offensive that the United States has not raised these human rights concerns in recent trade negotiations with China, and that the few enforcement actions that have been taken recently do not meet the scope or severity of this problem. At the same time, private sector actors, including companies that sell their final products to the United States, also have a clear responsibility to uphold the integrity of their supply chains. Global businesses must allocate whatever resources are needed to ensure that their upstream suppliers and manufacturers do not use forced labor. This is a crisis that demands a holistic solution with cooperation from both the United States government, international businesses, and international nations. I urge and encourage all of the entities involved to take aggressive action to disincentivize and eliminate the use of forced labor in our manufactured goods. My question goes to Ms. Lair. Amy, your testimony underscores the need for this sort of all-hands-on-deck approach to addressing this challenge, yet we continue to see the inaction from the Trump administration. What additional steps should the Trump administration take to pressure the Chinese government on these issues? Likewise, what diplomatic and regulatory tools are there at our disposal to make a bigger impact on this critically important issue of human rights?
Thank you for the question. I think the first step is just showing really consistent commitment to multilateral institutions and consistent leadership that's principles-based. And that alone will help restore our allies' confidence in us and help them join in an effort like this where they know there may be repercussions from China. I think that Kathy provided the point that the UN has been quite inactive on this and that there's an opportunity for a lot more action there. The more the US engages and engages with its human rights mechanisms, the more likely that is going to be to occur. Well, right now, China is actually undermining those human rights mechanisms very actively because of the vacuum the US has left. In terms of our own regulatory tools, I mean, I think there's quite a range of options, and obviously people have talked about CBP a lot, and that's one piece of the puzzle. There's also the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, and you can bring both civil and criminal actions under that, private actors and the government. We haven't seen it used in this context at all, and in fact, it's used very, very little. And so I think there's an opportunity there. It's just another tool in the toolkit. I think there's also opportunities, as I said, to really enhance traceability in supply chains that isn't there right now. And so I think there's a range of tools. And I just wanted to put a little touch point on the traceability discussion, which is that some of these new techniques, some of the companies have really extensive libraries from Xinjiang and actually do have the ability to identify origin. Thank you.
Kathy, in the time I have left, do you mind talking about the ramifications for American workers if we do not fully address the human rights abuses against the Uyghur people and other instances of forced labor around the globe?
Thank you so much for your question. It sends, first of all, it sends a strong message that this country doesn't care about worker rights or how our supply chains are built. We just heard the news this week. Our manufacturing numbers are going down despite what's happening. We have our machinists union that has come out with very specific examples of how their membership's been hollowed out. They cannot compete with forced labor. What we want is a set of rules in the global economy that work for workers here and work for workers around the world. We think it can happen, that you can have decent work and allow workers to live with dignity. No workers should be pitted against each other. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for indulging me and going over time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very, very much. Did Mr. Panetta or Ms. Murphy join us? We skipped them over. If not, we'll go to Mr. Schweikert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, for those of us, and I know there's a number on the committee who've been interested in this subject, some of the issues we're talking about have been around us for at least in my decade in Congress. How many of us remember several years ago when we were having the discussion of what was happening in Bangladesh? So, we need to be intellectually consistent all the time as we work on this, on, the fragility of sometimes, actors, the institutions and those, and how we need to come up with a unified front. To our witnesses, I do have a question. We've seen some of the testimony, we've seen your documentation, the scale of the issue in Western China with the Muslim Uyghur population. Are there other populations also being exploited, whether it be religious or ethnic or regional minorities? Can anyone answer, do we need even a broader understanding of worker exploitation happening in China right now? Anyone with a thought on that? I'm
happy to jump in, and then I know my colleagues. The Afl-Cio has worked on this for decades, also with you, and worker rights issues have been an issue for years. So I would just say the overall framework in China is repressive. We have labor activists who are imprisoned. So, I think there's no independent trade union movement. So yes, it is anyone speaks out about it.
Yeah, my interest is there another religious minority or ethnic minority or regional population that we're also learning is being forced into production labor?
There are other Turkic Muslim minority groups, in addition to the Uyghurs, in the region, who are subject to the same level of repression, the same instances of forced labor as the Uyghurs. One of the factories that's the subject of a new WRO from CBP is in the prefecture of Yili against the Kazakh border, where the population is ethnically Kazakh. But again, the same repression, the same forced labor across all the Turkic Muslim minority groups in the region.
Okay, thank you. And my reason for asking that question is I'm a believer that we're on the cusp of having technology we can make it broad-based enough to truly understand sourcing. We even had a presentation before COVID of a company that was experimenting with almost a DNA testing of sorts on products that came by to be able to even identify regions and workers' populations. But we'll need to understand what we're looking for. Heaven forbid we come up with a methodology where we start to be able to block certain Uyghur exploited products to only find out that we just pushed it somewhere else. Does anyone have on the panel have an expertise on the next generation of technology that can help us identify products that were made through exploitation?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I'll take a stab at that. So yeah, there's a lot of work being done, whether it's DNA-based or checking out trace elements of that are present in the soil. So when you grow cotton and blend it and harvest it and so forth, that those elements will then show up in the fiber and then they will show up in the finished product. I would be cautious about saying where those are. There's still a lot of work to be done to determine whether they can be used and all of the different ways that we may need to validate it, whether it can be a proper enforcement tool and so forth. I'll just give you one example. If you are looking at the technology where you look at the trace elements, for example, the US has calcium in its soil, India has some in their soil, Brazil, Argentina, they do as well. As you blend those fibers together, and then you look at the finished number, all those numbers, do they add up together? Do they cancel each other out? And so you may end up with a false result because you have now taken something that you could have traced individually, an individual fiber, if it wasn't blended with anything else, with a bunch of other fibers. And the nature of the cotton industry is very, very fungible. It's a fungible commodity, and it gets blended. Many of the kind of cottons that we grow here, long staple, is what they also grow in the region, the Xinjiang region.
Sure.
There we are. So,
all right, Mr. Chairman, as we move forward thinking about this whole subject area, I think it would be worthwhile to do two real key things: understand the scale of the problem. What other regions of the world is this type of human exploitation happening? And then what technology could we ever roll out, also propose to the EU and other purchasers around the world, and see if we can come up with a common threshold documentation. And the reason I bring this up is the blockchain caucus in the previous years.
I don't mean to be rude, Mr. Speaker. We've got other people waiting.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
I need to go over time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your tolerance.
No problem. No problem. I heard a rumor that Mr. Panetta may be back.
Right here.
You're on, Jimmy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity. Ranking Member Buchanan, and obviously all of the witnesses for providing your time, most importantly, your expertise in highlighting such an important issue that unfortunately some people and some in this administration are not. So we appreciate your efforts in this area. Look, I think we understand wholeheartedly, especially based on your testimony, that the United States relationship with China is really one of the most consequential in the world. China's, the second largest economy with high ambitions, having experienced exponential growth in recent decades and aggressively pursuing an economic dominance, as we're seeing. But as we know, it is also an absolute, and as you testified to, an absolutely abysmal record on human rights. Worse, it's becoming increasingly bold in its violations, as we've seen from Hong Kong to the Uyghur people at this point. Now, I think we all know, and has been said, we have trade relations with many nations who struggle to provide adequate labor rights. And some of those nations, though, don't have the capacity to enforce the laws on their books or on their preferential trade on which their preferential trade status relies. And this type of struggle to improve labor conditions, as we've seen, and I've seen firsthand based on my time under the leadership of Chairman Blumenauer, that this struggle to improve these labor conditions is common. But China, as we know, is just not a developing country, and it's not a country that's struggling to enforce its laws, and unfortunately it's struggling to make honest efforts to improve that as well. Instead, China is using their state power to what appears to be absolutely discriminate against an ethnic and religious minority and strategically exploit them for its selfish economic gain. Now, the first step, I believe, is for this administration to raise this issue during trade negotiations with China. And I think it's beyond time that the United States starts to take these types of crimes from China against its Uyghur people very, very seriously. Now, Mr. Lear, if I could start off with you, I know in your testimony you noted that China is unique in that it is actually facilitating forced labor and not simply failing to prevent it. And so I'd ask is there any precedent in that? Are there any other examples of trade partners with the United States engaging in this direct forced labor? And if so, how has the United States addressed it?
That's a great question. Thank you. So a couple of comments on that. I think the situation in Xinjiang is actually rather unique because it's not just that the government itself is involved in creating these patterns of forced labor, but that it's part of this larger pattern of abuses that have been called crimes against humanity. And so that makes it, in my opinion, pretty unique. There are other examples of state-supported, encouraged, or run forced labor, for example, in Turkmenistan. And there's a ban on cotton from Turkmenistan. So there's been a US response to that. But it's not, even that, it's terrible, but it's not the same in the sense that it's not that the Turkmen government isn't also rounding up all those people who are being forced to work and putting them in detention facilities and trying to end their attachment to their religion. I hope that helps. Thank you.
Got it. It does. Thank you very much, Ms. Lear. And is there, I guess, I think you probably have an opinion on this, and I'd love to hear it. Any reason why the USTR has not raised or made the importation of products using this type of forced labor an issue in the context of our trade relationship with China?
I think there was a decision to separate out the labor and human rights issues. And I would just note that's not consistent with what we've done in past situations. In my testimony, flagged the fact that under President Reagan, in our relationships with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, human rights were always a pillar of every single conversation at a high level with that government. And I think that's appropriate in this situation.
Great. Thank you, Ms. Lear. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Dobeni?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses. This is such an incredibly important topic, and just terrible stories about what's happening with forced labor. Ms. Abbas, thank you in particular for sharing your story and highlighting how critical it is that we take action. I wanted to ask you, Ms. Lear, if you had suggestions on how financial regulators in the G7 and other advanced economies could work together on increased transparency requirements for banks and private equity firms that have significant investments in Chinese companies that are complicit in these gross human rights abuses. I know, for example, it was reported last year that the Swiss bank UBS was one of the biggest investors in Hikvision, which is a video surveillance systems company that's profited from security spending in the region. So I'd love your thoughts on that.
This is a really important topic that hasn't gotten a lot of attention. I did testify on it in front of the US SURF Commission recently. So the concern is that, for example, when Hikvision was put on what's called the entities list, it turned out that large US pension funds were invested in it, public pension funds. And the interesting thing is that these technology companies are being put on the entities list, but that doesn't actually affect the ability of US entities to invest in them. So it's a real gap in oversight. I would also add to the list venture capital. I would suspect that a lot of the money going to these emerging technology companies in China that are testing out their products in Xinjiang, it's probably venture capital. And right now there's no natural home for that oversight, but it could be added to a disclosure requirement. In particular, if companies are investing in entities on the entities list, that seems reasonable to ask for information on, or you could expand it more to companies involved in developing emerging technology and using it in that region. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Feingold, in July, the New York Times published an article that some Chinese personal protective equipment manufacturers, PPE manufacturers, were using forced Uyghur labor to meet the increased demand from the pandemic. We know the president's failure to address this issue with President Xi and to effectively use the Defense Production Act means that we still are overly reliant on imports from China to address our persistent shortages of PPE. I wondered if you knew what immediate steps we could and should take to address our increased dependence on personal protective equipment that could be produced by forced labor.
Thank you, Representative, so much for that question. Absolutely. I think the crisis, this pandemic, showed what happened when we've allowed our supply chains to kind of go out of control, right, where there's no regulation. I think we need to look at some of the debate that's happening around, bringing those supply chains back closer to home so that they're regulated in a way that, protect worker rights. We know how things are being made. And again, one other idea that we haven't discussed here is there's a whole tool that we have, which is around procurement policy as well. We haven't, that's another tool that the government has at looking at, how are products being made and making sure that they're not being made with forced labor. But I think on the supply chain issues we discussed, we need different manufacturing policies that bring things back closer to home, make sure they're made with worker rights. And since this was produced in the Uyghur region, we have to assume it was made with the forced labor that's been documented.
Thank you. Ms. Lair, I have one more question for you. You mentioned earlier about kind of what we could do to encourage the tools we have to encourage companies to shift supply chains. And you mentioned the Development Finance Corporation. Are there ways for the Development Finance Corporation to partner with other development banks like the Japan Bank for International Cooperation or the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development to create a program to support the development of new supply chains in the region?
So I think if we're serious about cutting out Xinjiang forced labor from certain supply chains, there have to be some robust efforts to develop new ones. And certainly involving various development banks is one option. And I think having that proactive, coordinated approach would be really powerful. And I would just add, if we're going to put this effort in, let's make sure we do it the right way with really strong labor safeguards this time so we're not recreating a problem.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Ms. Dobeni. Mr. Smith?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing on this critically important topic. This committee has heard me speak many times about the success of President Trump's tough stance on China. While many experts dismiss his policies as unproductive, his achievements are right in front of us. A fully enforceable trade agreement with China signed in January of this year. Unfortunately, China's abusive practices are just as much inward as they are outward. Their use of forced labor is an ongoing injustice we must continue to confront. And just as the president has held China accountable for their abusive trade practices towards the U.S., his administration continues to hold China accountable for its abuses against its people by aggressively enforcing our prohibition on the use of forced labor. The U.S. must continue to be a world leader on confronting forced labor. And thanks to the strong actions of the Trump administration, we are. With my remaining time, I'd like to address a concern that came up earlier. I want to thank my friend, Mr. Pascarell, for bringing up the difficulty presented by complicated supply chains. This is truly one of the most challenging pieces in tackling the evil of forced labor. I reached out, in fact, to the Kraft Heinz company to better understand what Mr. Pascarell spoke about just a bit ago. They assured me that none of their products, from tomatoes to any other goods imported to the United States, are sourced from the Xinjiang region. Kraft Heinz is also working with my friend and colleague from Missouri, Congresswoman Vicky Hartzler, who is a member of the China Commission Executive Committee and has a Kraft Heinz facility in her district to provide support as we address this problem more broadly. I believe this is important information for this committee to know. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time the committee has dedicated to this important topic, and I thank all of our witnesses for their commitment to ending forced labor. Thank you, Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith. And you raised some interesting points. I think it might be worthwhile for the subcommittee at some point to delve a little further into the consequences of the Trump-China policy with skyrocketing trade deficits, no enforceability for the items that are there, and that damage that the tariffs have done to American business and consumers. And I think that might be a productive opportunity for us to move forward. We have.
Chairman, I would also recommend maybe looking at all of the ag products that's been purchased in the month of July, such as the largest production of corn.
I think it would be great to look at the big picture, Mr. Smith.
Look at that all, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Ms. Murphy, have you joined us?
I have. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, great.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses for joining us today. I wanted to make some brief remarks broadly about my approach to the U.S.-China relationship, which is the most significant bilateral relationship in the world today. But first, I want to just acknowledge the heart-wrenching testimony of Ms. Abbas, who told how her activism has led to her sister's disappearance by the Chinese authorities and presumed incarceration in one of the Uyghur re-education camps. My own family feared and suffered from the brutality of a communist regime. And at that time, they were also sending Vietnamese people into re-education camps. So I'm deeply sympathetic and moved by your story. Thank you so much for your bravery in speaking out against the atrocities in Xinjiang. It's an incredibly moving story, and I appreciate your testimony today. As it relates to Chinese policy under the Chinese Communist Party, especially its foreign and defense policies, its trade policies, its human rights records, I have a lot of concern about where all of those things are going. And I think my concerns have only deepened as a result of China's mishandling of the Chinese government's mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic and their campaign of dishonesty and disinformation that made this pandemic far worse than it had to be. My concerns have led me to introduce legislation that requires the U.S. government to identify and combat efforts by the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, to exploit the pandemic to advance its foreign policy objectives to the detriment of the United States and our allies. You know, at its core, this bilateral relationship is really a contest over divergent values and interests. It's a contest between opposed political and economic systems and different visions for the future of Asia and the world writ large. And in this contest, the U.S. needs to be unapologetically defending its interests and values. And the United States needs to be preparing for competition across a range of areas. But even as we move into an era of increased competition, I think the U.S. also needs to try to preserve some areas of cooperation on issues like North Korea and climate change, pandemic preparedness and response, and non-proliferation. You know, we cannot and should not convert a nation of 1.4 billion people into a cartoon villain. You know, China isn't going anywhere, and we have to figure out how to coexist and continue to bring it into alignment as a good participant in the community of nations that we have. We need to do the best we can to try to shape and influence its behavior. And our greatest chance of success will come from two approaches, one international and one domestic. First, I think we have to work with our allies in Europe and Asia to influence China's behavior, whether that's around abusive trade and investment practices or blatant human rights violations. And then secondly, I think it's really important that Democrats and Republicans need to work together. China policy has become very politicized, even though there's fairly broad agreement on policy. We have to remember that we're strongest internationally when we're united domestically and weakest on the global stage when we're divided along partisan lines. And China's horrific and unacceptable human rights abuses in Xinjiang have rightly caused bipartisan concern. And bipartisan outrage is an important precondition to strong U.S. action to try to change Chinese behavior. We have to be clear-eyed and not play political football with an issue this urgent. The CCP is trying to strip the Uyghur people of their dignity as human beings, subjecting them and other Turkic Muslims to horrific human rights violations, including forced labor. And we can't sit by and let this happen. We have to act using all of our foreign policy tools available to us, including working with our allies. I think our goal has to be to stop these horrific human rights violations from occurring. Ms. Ler, given what I just laid out, what does a comprehensive U.S. policy to protect the Uyghurs look like? And how can we leverage all of the various elements of U.S. power to apply maximum pressure on the CCP while minimizing the harmful repercussions for the United States security and economic interests?
So that's obviously a huge question. I think, first of all, again, when we're engaging on this, being very principles-based, that we're not against China, we're against human rights abuses, and we'd be against abuses by any country doing this. So I think especially in multilateral fora and with our bilateral allies, that consistent messaging around the facts is very important because that will help them get on board. But I think, again, it's about elevating this issue in a lot of different places where we have historically had a lot of influence. And again, that includes the UN. Why hasn't the UN High Commissioner conducted an investigation of what's happening? Can we re-engage in the UN Human Rights Committee? Because frankly, China is starting to run that show. And so trying to hold them accountable there certainly isn't very viable right now. How do we engage with the G7? Is this even on the table? So I think there's a whole range.
As you indicated, it's a very complex and long, but you started the answer when Congresswoman Murphy's time expired. So I'd like, no, that's no problem, but I'd like to move on to Mr. Byer, who's been patiently waiting.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And thank all of you for being part of this. I just wanted to understand that. I understand that an updated version of Congressman McGovern's HR 6210 has been noticed at the Rules Committee, and I haven't had a chance to review the updates, but it's actually good to know that the House is moving forward on this. Ms. Abbas, I know we're talking about forced labor, but I'd love your insight on, especially in light of potential news this week in the U.S., all the AP reports on forced sterilizations, a 7-fold increase from 16 to 18, and the huge increase in apparently involuntary IUDs, and what your experience through your family, extended family, has been.
Thank you so much for bringing this up. The Uyghur women are facing basically forced sterilization and the forced abortions. So cutting off the bloodline, not allowing Uyghur babies to be born, putting all the Uyghur men into jail, and the forcing Uyghur women to marry Han Chinese. This is the one strong aspect of this being active genocide, what's happening in our homeland right now. So, with that, we should never second guess any kind of conflicts between trade deal and against China's, forcing China's enforcing sanctions against the labor camps, removing China's cheapest input to its trade advantage. Forced labor is the type of rule-based international trade that must be insisted upon and not something bargained away. So I plead each of you to support the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Just to think about those Uyghur women who are forced to give up their being a mother, no matter if they have the second child or eligible for having another baby, they are forced to sterilizations, and we have witnesses, and we are hearing from those inmates that what kind of horrible things are happening, not only in 3 million or more Uyghur in concentration camps, but just regular people are living in regular lives. So I'm just going to use a minute to show my sister's picture. This is my sister, and she is one of those millions of Uyghur women. So please do whatever you can, because as Ms. Murphy mentioned, China is basically buying out the compliance of the United Nations, the compliance of the World Health Organizations, the Hollywood, the celebrities, NBA, now Disney, and the International Olympic Committee getting rewarded by the international community hosting the Olympic Beijing 2022. So please just act. Thank you for
Thank you, Ms. Abbas, very much. Ms. Feingold, and it was a long time ago, and Jimmy Carter, who's a big Brzezinski, first put human rights into play in American foreign policy. You know, we've been bragging with Democrats and Republicans about the success of USMCA, which the Afl-Cio actually endorsed. You know, the new gold standard for labor and environmental things. Is there any reason we shouldn't use those USMCA labor standards in future negotiations with China?
I think absolutely that should be our starting point. So we should start with what we got negotiated in the USMCA, enforceable worker rights, and I think we should build from there. We may need to look at other tools that we would include. So a USMCA plus, given the egregious worker rights violations in China, we may need to get other tools to complement USMCA.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Nova, we've had a lot of discussion about the possibility of the regional orders, the legislation blocking goods from Xinjiang, but there's also the issue of Uyghur prisoners who've been moved to facilities outside. How do we address those concerns?
There is a labor transfer scheme the Chinese government is utilizing to transfer Uyghur workers from the Uyghur region to factories all across China as part of its overall campaign of repression and social control. And there are risks of forced labor as a result of factories across China in numerous economic sectors. And it is incumbent upon brands and retailers to take aggressive action to ensure that their suppliers outside of the Uyghur region are not engaging in this scheme. And just a broader point about industry action, apparel brands and retailers have known for 2 years that there is widespread forced labor in the Uyghur region and that it's impossible to address it through normal due diligence mechanisms. Under those circumstances, they should have already exited the region. By not doing so, they've created a situation where they continue to import goods made with forced labor. That's why there's a call to action from global civil society asking brands and retailers to publicly commit to leave the region. It's why CBP is considering a region-wide WRO. It's why, of course, Congress is considering legislation. During the time it's taken to conduct this hearing, tens of thousands of American consumers have unwittingly purchased goods with content from the Uyghur region, much of it made with forced labor. And until comprehensive action is taken, that reality will persist.
Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Beyer. Well, I certainly appreciate the engagement of all the committee members, the cooperation of Mr. Buchanan and the Republicans. We're, I think, getting a sense, despite the complexity that has been revealed, that there is, in fact, a powerful consensus against forced labor and what is happening to the Uyghurs. I appreciate Mr. Lamar's expression of commitment on behalf of the industry to work with us to solve this problem. It's clear we need more transparency, starting with the administration in terms of what it's doing at the border. It's important to hold the administration accountable. I think that is an important element here that we need to pursue. But I look forward to working with the committee to seize this moment. I think there is an opportunity. I appreciate the range of ideas that were expressed and the commitment people have to help solve this horrific problem. We're going to conclude the hearing. Members will have 2 weeks.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes?
This is
Tom.
Swaz.
Oh, Tom, I am so sorry. I am so sorry. You're on, Tom. You're on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know everybody's anxious to get off, so I'll try and be as quick as possible. I'm actually at the airport myself.
I apologize. I got ahead of myself. Are you muted, Tom? I'm not hearing you, Tom. Are you muted?
Can you hear me now?
Yes. I'm not hearing anything. Does that work, Tom? Can you?
Now? Nope, I guess you can't hear me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you're coming through. You're coming through, Tom. You were coming through. I can see you, but not hear you.
Okay. I guess we'll have to cancel this. All right. Thanks very much anyway.
I can hear you there, Tom, when you're outside. You're coming in.
Yeah. I'll try one last time because I don't want to hold the people up. The reality is that we need to pass the Forced Labor Prevention Act. We can't rely on technology or an individual one-off catching companies. We can't check the calcium in the soil. Listen to the language we heard today. Crimes against humanity, forced sterilization, people being taken away from their families, people that are being forced to eat pork when it violates their religion, people that are being forced not to read their prayers, to be re-educated. We can't say it's okay, this business over here, but the one down the street, that we caught that one. The Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party is cheating and it's treating its people awfully. We've seen it in Hong Kong. We've seen it with the Tibetans. We see it with the Uyghurs. They're cheating as far as stealing technology from us. We have to start holding more of a hard line against this type of behavior. It is not acceptable. We should be encouraging cotton production in other countries, in the Northern Triangle of Central America, for example. We should not be, most of the cotton in the world comes out of China, and 84% of the cotton from China comes from the Xinjiang region. We cannot allow this economic sabotage and this crimes against humanity to continue, and we must take a strong action. I hope that people will support the Uyghur Act Against Forced Labor. There are currently 17 Republicans on the bill, one of which was Mark Meadows before he went to the White House. There are 11 senators in the Republican senators as well. I encourage my colleagues to get on this bill. Let's try and get it passed. Let's hold them accountable in China to get them to change their behavior. They will not change their behavior. Think of what they're doing. Everybody in the world knows that they have 1.5 million people that they're treating in subhuman conditions, yet they continue to flout the world community. We have to hold them accountable. We have to get our corporations on board with us. We need to support our corporations to source their products from other locations that would be beneficial to us economically as well as far as foreign policy goes. But China must be held accountable for their behavior. I was going to ask some questions, but I feel bad that I'm holding everybody up already. I support everything the witnesses have to say.
Go ahead, ask questions. It's just me here, and take advantage.
Okay, Mr. Lamar, I want to ask you. I mean, I understand what you were talking about, and you spoke about how difficult it is to actually catch these companies in the act, how difficult it is to identify the use of forced labor, and you need better technology, and you need government-to-government action, and we need all these different things. Why don't we pass this bill? Why don't we say that you can't take any products from the Xinjiang region unless they put the onus on them, who are benefiting from this economically, put the onus on them to show clear and convincing evidence that they are not using forced labor. We're trying to change their behavior. This is not just a dollars and cents issue. We're talking, think of the language we heard today. Crimes against humanity, forced sterilization, people being forced to violate their religious beliefs by eating pork during Ramadan, families afraid to go back to their native land, families afraid that their loved ones, they can't speak out because their loved ones are going to be imprisoned or worse. We have got to take action. And I understand the economic sacrifices that need to be made here. And we need to pull together as a nation to our textile industries to help them to source cotton from other locations. But we need you, Mr. Lamar, more than anybody here as a representative of industry and as the Republican witness here today to say, you know what, we really have to do something about this. This is against our values as a nation. And it's only going to happen if we all do it together. So how do you feel about that, Mr. Lamar?
Well, Congressman, we are against this. It's against our values as a nation, and we need to do something about it. I completely agree with you. I think the reason, because it's complicated and because we've heard all of this testimony about the horrific problems which go beyond forced labor, very, very horrific problems, that's why we need to be smart about it. The WROs, in our opinion, aren't what's going to address the regional WROs, not what's going to address all of the range of problems that we've been talking about. WROs have their role, and we need to do them. They need to be more.
If China is the largest manufacturer of the largest grower of cotton in the world, and 84% of the cotton comes from Xinjiang, and if America takes this action and says we are doing a regional ban against cotton from this region, you don't think China will react to that? Finally, this around the edges, waiting for the technology, checking the calcium in the soil. They're not going to react to that. They're going to play this game, try and outsmart us and do what they do regularly. I agree with Congresswoman Murphy and others who said this is an important relationship. We have to continue the relationship. However, some things are simply unacceptable. And the way they are treating the Uyghurs and others is unacceptable. And we must take, this is not like, maybe they're doing forced labor. Maybe they're doing crimes against humanity. Maybe there's forced sterilization. Maybe people are being arrested. Maybe this is going, no, this is happening. And we have got to act as a country, as a nation, business, government, labor, everybody together to say, boy, this is really bad stuff. We can't have our kids 20 years from now look back at this and say, wait a minute, we could have, the price of cotton went up per whatever it would be. I mean, we have to recognize we have to do something. And listen, I know that I'm pro-business. I want to see the textile industry and other industries boom, and I want to support them. But we need to support other growers of cotton because, God forbid, China does not act. We're going to have to find a source of cotton somewhere else anyway. So let's start supporting other countries that want to try and comply with the world order of values and try and support them in that effort. All right, Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, I got excited.
We appreciate your joining the subcommittee, Tom. Appreciate your passion and your involvement and look forward to working with you as we move forward. Members will have 2 weeks to submit written questions to our witnesses to be answered later in writing. Those questions and your answers will be made part of the formal hearing record. We deeply appreciate your engagement with us today. I think it was extraordinarily productive and informative for us. And I'm looking forward to working with us all to make some progress to address this intolerable situation. Thank you very much. The committee is adjourned.
Thank you. Thank you, Congressman Susie. Congressman
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you all for the opportunity.